Welcome to this online lesson, the second part of looking at weapons and wounds in World War I. Sickness, gangrene and shell shock. The aims of this lesson are to gather information about World War I wounds, to explain the risks of World War I wounds, and to compare and evaluate the risks of those wounds. Here's a do now task. Steel helmets were first given to British soldiers in 1916. When they became common, why did the number of head injuries go up and not down? You'll have to use a little bit of lateral thinking with this one. Also, during battles where men depended on each other, why did the rate of sickness go down despite the conditions that these men were living in? Again, you might want to use a little bit of lateral thinking on that too. Give it some thought, note down some answers, and then I'll reveal the answers to you. Pause the video while you do this. How did you get on? Well, let's consider the issue of steel helmets first of all. Why did the number of head injuries go up rather than down once soldiers were provided with protection for the head? Well, it's precisely because of that. Head injuries went up because the number of head fatalities went down. So men tended to be wounded in the head rather than killed outright, skewing the statistics. This is a classic example of survivor bias. You might therefore associate helmets with increasing the numbers of head injuries and therefore being a bad thing, when actually it's a good thing. Those are injuries rather than fatalities. What about the next one then? Men depend on each other in battle, so why did the number of sicknesses go down? Well, actually, the number of sicknesses didn't go down. The number of men who reported sickness went down. Men tended to cope with mild illness rather than sit out a battle. They didn't want to let down their buddies, they didn't want to be seen as being soft, and so therefore lots of men who were quite sick decided to stay at the front line. This might range from kind of common coughs and colds and sneezes to more serious things like dysentery. But they often felt that sickness, as long as it wasn't completely debilitating, wasn't sufficient excuse to be away from the front where their mates were relying on them. And they didn't want anyone to think ill of them. Unhealthy trenches. Review your notes on conditions in the trenches. If you don't have any of these, have a look at one of my earlier lessons, in fact lesson 1 of this playlist. Note down between 2 and 5 examples of health hazards caused by time in the trenches. As an extension, you could make some specific links between the health problem and what caused it. Pause the video while you do this. Whatever you came up with, we're now going to have a look at some of the common health complaints that people suffered in the trenches. Started with one of the more famous ones, trench foot. Have a look at the picture first of all. A doctor inspects soldiers' feet looking for signs of trench foot. This trench looks quite dry and well kept, and yet these soldiers are still having their feet examined. You might want to be able to explain how soldiers might try and avoid trench foot once we've considered the issue. Conditions in the trenches could cause incredibly unpleasant effects on soldiers' feet. Soldiers were often unable to change out of soaking cold boots. Some soldiers also found that their boots were too tight, worsening the problem. In fact, it was relatively rare for a soldier to really have a comfortable pair of boots. They were made to standard sizes after all. All this resulted in restricting blood flow to the feet, which in turn caused parts of the flesh to die. If you want to get an idea as to how easily that could become infected as well, think about the last time you spent too long on the bath. What were the ends of your fingers and toes like? Did the flesh go all brittle and soft and white and delicate? Because that's very much how these soldiers' feet were, so it was even more dangerous to them. But really it's the restriction of the blood that tends to cause the most permanent damage. Not only did trench foot stink, untreated it could lead to something called gangrene. This is rotting flesh that needed amputation. In other words, your flesh has died while you're still alive and it's starting to rot. It could even cause blood poisoning, which was often fatal. Up to 1/6 of the army could be affected by trench foot in cold weather. 1/6. So 1 in 6 of all the soldiers would be suffering from trench foot in cold weather. That's a lot of men who are not going to be as effective fighters. So, summarise the causes and effects of trench foot, and if you have time, have a go at that extension at the bottom too. Pause the video while you do this. We're now going to have a look at source A, which is a description of trench foot, and also source B, which will be some photos of trench foot. Be warned that these photos of trench foot are not pleasant viewing. However, it's quite important to view them to give you an understanding of what trench foot was really all about. So if you feel you can stomach it, just consider yourself warned. Your task will be as follows. How similar are these 3 sources? Identify between 1 and 2 similarities and then 3 or 4 differences. As a challenge, explain which sources are most useful when investigating the condition. Remember, usefulness amounts to relevant information that you feel you can really trust. Here are the photographs first of all. Pretty disgusting. We can see here that the feet are swelling and the blackened dead flesh on the end of the toes has been pushed off, almost like pulling the fingers of a pair of gloves off, but much more disgusting than that. You can see that some of the other feet appear to have been amputated with bits of the bones that are showing through. Not feet, sorry, the toes. So we've got swelling, we've got the blackening of skin, and we've got the idea that the gangrene is setting in and pushing the flesh actually off of the bones. Similarly unpleasant. Here the medical orderlies seem to be trying to chase the infection, and various bits of the feet have been amputated in order to catch it. Obviously this is a kind of a situation where they've got to balance how much they actually cut off versus how much they leave on. Do they cut off enough to fight the infection while still giving the soldier a good chance of mobility, or do they cut off too much and they could have left him with more? It was a very difficult call. Here we have Harry Roberts, a British soldier, in source A, describing trench foot. Again, look for the similarities and differences. If you have never had trench foot described to you, I will explain. Your feet swell to 2 to 3 times their normal size and go completely dead. You can stick a bayonet into them and not feel a thing. A bayonet, remember, is the knife that you put on the end of a gun. If you are lucky enough not to lose your feet and the swelling starts to go down, it is then that the most indescribable agony begins. I've heard men cry and scream with pain, and many have had to have their feet and legs amputated. I was one of the lucky ones, but one more day in that trench and it may have been too late. All right, 1 to 2 differences, 3 to 4, or 1 to 2 similarities rather, and 3 to 4 differences. Pause the video and have a go at that now. Hopefully we've identified some differences then. We can actually see the swelling that's described by Harry Roberts in the top photograph. We can also get that sense of the feet going completely dead and how agonising that would be, with parts of the feet rotting and even with amputations taking place. He also says, 1 more of the day than I may have had to have my feet and legs amputated, and we can see that process happening in the bottom photograph. What about the differences then? Well, obviously in the photographs we do not get any sort of sense of the pain, how it would have felt, and the cries and screams that people might have heard and might have experienced as well. We can't get a sense of the smell either. Nor can we get a sense of how it felt to get trench foot or how lucky he felt not to get it. In other words, the effect that the fear of trench foot might have had upon the soldiers. Our next medical problem in the trench is trench fever. You might want to note this down as a subheading. Pyrexia of unknown origin, PUO. This is what World War I doctors called trench fever. The symptoms are shown in the diagram, and it's pretty unpleasant, but not fatal. Back pain, a rash, fever, headache, eye pain, muscle aches, and joint pain. Although these things probably wouldn't kill a soldier, they probably would make them a less effective soldier or possibly take them out the front line. Trench fever usually lasted about 5 days, but it would often recur. So if you got over trench fever once, you could probably expect to get it again soon. We now know, as they found out at the time, that trench fever was caused by infestations of lice. Rats also roamed the trenches, fat on the corpses of no man's land. At the Battle of the Somme, one medical officer recorded that 422 out of the 560 men that he inspected had lice. In these modern times of better hygiene, we're exceptionally unlikely to suffer from this condition at all in our lives. Sure, as children occasionally we get head lice, but not the body lice that we're describing here, and you can see these disgusting creatures in the picture there. But remember, men in the trenches were living in unsanitary conditions, near to the rats, and without regular access to hygiene and baths. So, for our next bit, summarise the causes and effects of trench fever. Pause the video now while you do that. So hopefully we've identified that trench fever is caused by lice. The lice are spread by the rats, and you've recorded some of the symptoms and how often it would reoccur. To follow that up, what could the army do to try and limit the lice people had on them? Pause the video while you consider that, and then we'll think about what your answer should be. Alright, so what did we come up with? Part of it is about hygiene. Giving soldiers the opportunity to bathe, shower and wash properly was virtually impossible in the trenches. But in breaks behind the lines, this absolutely was possible and was often done. There's also the treatment of soldiers' uniforms. Sometimes these would be steam treated to kill any lice that were in there and also to destroy the eggs of the lice. Other times the soldiers' uniforms would be too far gone, they'd simply need to be destroyed and then replaced. It was always they were always fighting a losing battle though. Soldiers sitting around delousing each other's uniforms or their own uniforms would often spend time to do this, despite the fact that they knew that it wasn't really going to get rid of all of them. One final follow-up then. The following methods were tried to actually beat the lice. Fumigating clothes, so that means steam treating them or treating them with gas. Washing facilities. Disinfecting bedding that the soldiers were using. Washing in paraffin. Yes, that's right, flammable paraffin was a pretty effective deterrent for lice, but not very pleasant for the person. And showering. Which methods do you think would be most effective? And do you think these methods help get rid of the lice more, or simply to keep the soldiers' morale up and happy? Explain your opinion. Pause the video while you answer those follow-ups. The truth is, regular washing facilities and showering would have really helped with this, but it wouldn't have altered the conditions in the trenches. Even when they got rid of the lice, the chances are they were simply going to get them back again when they went back into the trenches. So did these methods help get rid of the lice for real, or was it more about keeping soldiers happy? In truth, it's probably a bit of both, but the morale issue is really important here. Lice were really uncomfortable and unpleasant for the soldiers. And so the idea that they were trying to do something to combat them would have improved their morale. At least they were trying to solve the problem rather than just leaving it. Okay, this is a pretty big one. Note it down as a new subheading. NYD.N, shell shock. These are two terms that we wouldn't use to describe the condition today, but it's important to understand that they were the terms used at the time to describe this condition. NYD.N is not yet diagnosed nervous. That really underplays the sort of condition it's describing. This was the army euphemism, in other words, they're saying one thing to mean something else, for shell shock, what we'd now call post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This photograph shows a real First World War British soldier suffering from shell shock. We might be able to infer that this photograph was taken not just to demonstrate that the soldier had shell shock, but possibly to record one of the potential reasons why he had shell shock. Notice the damage to his helmet. This is shrapnel damage that may have wounded the man, or it could be bullet damage from a near miss from a sniper. It's hard to tell. Look at the soldier's face though. It almost looks like he might be smiling. But look at his eyes. That reveals to you the real exhaustion and terror on this man's face. A faraway stare, something that is sometimes referred to as the 1,000-yard stare, where they just seem to be unblinking and staring into the distance. Here's another one. Well, this soldier very much is smiling, but it's not a natural smile. It's a sort of horrible grimace. Again, the eyes are a bit of a giveaway here. You can tell that this man is not happy, anything but. Look at his closed body language, the way he's clutching at himself. Clearly, mentally, he is somewhat disintegrated. And given what people suffered in the First World War, it's hard to blame him. So these two soldiers through shell shock showed different reactions to the horror that they had witnessed. Shell shock wasn't widely understood in the First World War. Also, many shell shock victims were classed as NYD.N mild. In other words, they were expected to recover soon. We know that this isn't really how mental illness works now. And originally, NYD.N cases were sent back to England to rest. But the army was worried about this fear becoming contagious and people faking the condition to get out of the fighting. How common this really would have been, well, it's difficult to tell. From 1916 to 1917, Men were treated for NYD.N, all treated in France, a few miles behind the front lines. Think of that. You're trying to treat post-traumatic stress disorder within actual being able to hear the guns in the distance. A bit of a reminder and a bit of a trigger for anyone suffering this condition. So question 8. Why do you think the army used the term not yet diagnosed nervous and not shell shock? And number 9. A. Why did the army change policy on where to treat the cases of not yet diagnosed nervous? How might this decision have affected the men? As an extension, how might this decision benefit the army? Pause the video while you make some notes on NYD.N on shell shock and answer those questions. So why did they use this euphemism? Part of it is wanting to limit the problem. This is not really well understood. It was understood that war was frightening and soldiers could suffer trauma, but it was believed that soldiers should be just able to snap out of it. After all, these generals were trying to fight a war. They needed soldiers in the front lines. They needed to give some sort of deterrence for men to not feel that, well, war is frightening, I can't carry on. Of course, this is not to limit their experiences and genuine mental health struggles, but at the time this simply wasn't understood. It looks heartless. In some ways it probably was, but we need to look at it in the context of what was understood at the time and the pressures that the army was facing in the war. So why did they change policy on where to treat cases of NYD.N? Well, they needed to keep the soldiers nearer to the front line so that they could be returned to units as soon as possible, especially where the doctors had diagnosed a mild case of NYD.N. How might this decision have affected the men? Well, very often a little bit of rest would make them feel better temporarily. But consider this, if they're going back to the front lines very quickly, are they likely to suffer the same again? Equally, are they likely to have a more superficial or fake recovery, especially given that they might be able to hear the guns in the distance? But how did it benefit the army? Well, that's really what it's all about. Firstly, men would have been deterred from stepping forward and saying that they were suffering from this sort of condition, because there wouldn't have no longer have been the offer of a trip home as a result. So they're trying to discourage men from doing this. Also, it allows men, like I say, to be returned to the front lines more quickly. And the brutal reality is, they needed as many men at the front line as possible. Here's some other examples of shell shock. There's a video that I've linked in the description. I urge you to watch it, even though it's really unpleasant viewing. Firstly, record down which symptoms the patients are displaying. For example, twitching or expressions of fear. How humane does their treatment appear to be? How effective do the treatments appear to be? And I do emphasise appear to be, because were they likely to have been as effective as they appear? Lastly, why might the filmmakers have made this? What is the purpose of this film? Why might the purpose of this film lead it to exaggerate the success of shell shock treatments in World War I? Pause the video here, make a note of those questions if you need to, watch the video and then complete your answers. Okay, hopefully you watched that now. Some of the typical symptoms that we see are, like we say, jerking movements and twitching, facial spasming and twitching as well, staring eyes, a little bit like we see in these pictures here, expressions of fear, like the soldier shrinking away when he's presented with the cap. Some of these happen to be French soldiers, by the way, or hiding under the bed, crying, even giggling, sometimes even like a fixed smile like we can see in this photograph as well. So how humane does the treatment appear to be? Well, to modern eyes, not very humane at all. For the benefit of the camera and to demonstrate the conditions, they're deliberately triggering some of these soldiers in order to behave in these ways. Other ones seem to be a little bit more humane, for example, exercising the neck and massaging in order to kind of soothe things and to reduce the appearance of the kind of physical tics that these soldiers have got as a result of their shell shock, as a result of their post-traumatic stress. So it's a bit of a mixture here. Now, some of the treatments, particularly those who are treating the sort of jerking movements of the soldiers as they're working along, they appear to be much more effective. So the soldiers who previously were virtually unable to walk or walked with a very strange kind of mannerism appear to be virtually fully recovered. But often what they're treating is the external symptom of the shock and the trauma, and not the trauma itself. And so they're not really that effective as treatments, and we better understand that today. So why might the purpose of this film lead it to exaggerate the success of shell shock treatments in World War I? Well, the purpose is one of propaganda, very likely. It's trying to demonstrate that shell shock was something that could be cured, and cured in a reasonably straightforward way. Perhaps this might be to try and lessen the apparent impact of it. So it's trying to show that these treatments were especially effective. They would have highlighted and filmed the treatments that give the most visible improvements, and probably ignored the ones that didn't appear to work. So how did they treat not yet diagnosed nervous? The army needed as many shell shock cases as possible to return to their duties as quickly as possible. The war needed to be won after all. There were over 80,000 recorded cases, but the real figure would have been much higher. Very few cases were diagnosed as not yet diagnosed nervous severe, as shown in the video that we saw earlier. Treatment mostly consisted of rest, good food, talks from doctors and others to calm them down. Don't mistake that for any sense of real professional therapy. Keep in contact with their unit, usually with letters. Here's a task. Note down the methods of treatment used to treat not yet diagnosed nervous. Do you think they work for mild cases? Rate the methods in order of effectiveness, then explain how effective these methods are likely to have been. And then explain how the experience of being diagnosed, not yet diagnosed nervous, would have had an effect on the men's self-esteem and how they felt about themselves. Pause the video here. So hopefully we've noted down those effects. Would they have worked for mild cases? Well, at least outwardly they probably would have done. Rest would have done anyone good, and if it lessened the stress that they were suffering, it probably would lessen their reaction to various triggers as well. What about good food? Again, similar effects. It's that sort of sense of home comforts of being looked after. Talks from doctors and others probably would have worked to a certain extent, but these men don't need calming down, they need mental health treatment. Again, it's not something that was really understood at the time. There was more of a sense in the army that you had to be strong and tough and hide these sorts of emotions. Keeping in contact with their unit could be really reassuring. These men really very rarely looked down on their mates. They didn't see them as being cowards. They didn't see them as letting the side down. However, this was a bit of a double-edged sword. As much as their comrades would likely give them the time of day and be very sympathetic to them, often these men felt that they were letting down their friends at the front. They wanted to get back to them, and in a way that only made their condition worse because they felt a sense of shame on top of everything else. So which ones are most effective? Probably rest is the most effective overall. So how would the experience of being diagnosed, not diagnosed yet nervous, have had an effect on men's self-esteem? Well, as I've alluded to just previously, there would be the sense that maybe they were not as strong as their comrades, maybe they felt like cowards, maybe they were even made to feel like cowards and that they were letting the side down. So it could really harm these men's self-esteem and, let's face it, probably delay their recovery. Okay, on to something completely different now. Treating infection. Note this down as a new subheading. Remember this gory diagram from before? A bullet wound. The bullet going through the leg, ripping up the flesh, grazing the bone and blasting out the other side. What you've got here is the bullet carried fragments of filthy clothing into the wounds, carrying germs into the body. Remember, this was very rarely freshly laundered uniforms that had been caked in mud. There was often a delay in getting the wounded from the battlefield to being treated and removing these fragments, allowing the infections to take hold regardless of what they did. In earlier wars like the Boer War, shown above, the ground was hard and dry. In World War I on the Western Front, the ground was wet and muddy. Centuries of manuring by farmers had made it absolutely full of germs. World War I was different to previous wars for the number of soldiers who died from infection from even minor wounds. Study the diagram. Firstly, describe the causes of infection. Secondly, explain why the World War I terrain made infection more likely. And lastly, Explain why World War I was worse than many other wars in terms of the risk of infection. You might also want to record a diagram of your own, a little bit like the one here. Pause the video while you complete this. So the causes of infection are filthy bits of clothing and fragments from bullets being carried into the wound, and also the delay in getting this treated. This is all made worse by the fact that the ground in World War I was very rich with bacteria because of farming practices. So World War I terrain made infection very likely because of the sheer amount of mud and filth and wetness that was found there. Unlike in previous wars, which tended not to have that level of mud and filth, like the Boer War we can see in the picture. Once infection took hold, there was little that could be done. There were no antibiotics to kill the infection, penicillin came after the war, and so thousands of soldiers died from what they call blood poisoning. So is this a new threat? Doctors had little experience of one of the most deadly and disgusting consequences of infection, gas gangrene. By the way, you're going to see some pretty unpleasant images here and unpleasant descriptions, so do brace yourself. Gangrene is where the infection causes the flesh to die and rot. Gas gangrene starts with a sweet smell and then turns red, yellow, and then eventually black and green as the skin dies. The bacteria causes gas to bubble and seep on the surface of the wound. It really is revolting stuff. You've got to imagine this is flesh that is literally rotting whilst the person is still alive. The only treatment for gas gangrene and much gangrene was amputation. There were no medicines that could fight these infections in the First World War. You may find the subsequent image disturbing, so consider yourself duly warned. Describe the symptoms of gas gangrene. What was the treatment? Why could so little be done to help patients? And there is the picture. Yuck. Okay, if you'd prefer not to be staring at that, skip back a couple of seconds and then just answer the questions. If not, if you can stomach it, pause the video now and then we'll carry on. So hopefully you've described the symptoms of gas gangrene in all of their disgusting glory. And what was the treatment? Well, that's a very simple question to answer. There was no treatment other than amputation. Finally, what made the wounds of World War I particularly devastating? How might treating wounds in World War I actually help medicine in the long run? And in your opinion, do you think cases of not yet diagnosed nervous, in other words shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder, were wounded? Explain your opinion. Pause the video now while you complete those tasks. So the wounds of World War I were particularly devastating because of the power of the weapons, the effect that they could have mentally on people, but also because of the high risk of infection. How might these treatments help medicine in the long run then? Well, new pioneering treatments were developed to try and patch soldiers up. But also, there's the frustration that was suffered from losing so many soldiers to light wounds who subsequently became infected and got gas gangrene or just gangrene. The same could be said for trench fit. Imagine if there was a medicine which could fight such things. Imagine if there was a doctor working on this who then made it his life's work to try and find such a treatment. Well, it might be argued that Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin and applied it to medicine, although he had lots of help in developing it, is just one such person who we can point to who was inspired by World War I to find future treatments. So are cases of not yet diagnosed nervous or shell shock wounded? Not physically, obviously. But I think today we can recognise that their wounds ran very deep. Once you had patched up a soldier who was injured, but otherwise not so traumatised, they could go back into action. They'd probably live a long, full and healthy and happy life. Someone with shell shock, though, especially with the mostly ineffective treatments of the time, might carry that trauma with him for the rest of his life. From a personal point of view, my grandfather suffered shell shock in the Second World War. There's absolutely no shame in this now, of course. It's very understandable knowing what he had to get up to in fighting the Japanese in Burma. And although this isn't a World War I example, it helps give some sort of context. And I certainly don't think any less of my granddad for this. In fact, it makes me think more of him. When he returned from the war, he was virtually unable to speak. Every time he tried to, especially when people triggered him with discussions of the war itself, he would just find himself in floods of tears. I was 10 years old when my granddad died. He died about 25 years ago. He had his last nightmare about the war the week before he died. It never left him. His physical wounds were healed and patched up. His mental scars never truly healed. On that rather sobering note, that's the end of the lesson. It's pretty serious stuff, so I hope it's been useful to you. I hope it's been interesting. If it has, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and there'll be more helpful content coming soon. Thanks very much for watching.